He thought he could destroy her with a single case, but that courtroom would become the place where his own power unraveled piece by piece. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories remind us how quickly power can turn. Now, back to Emma Carter. The courthouse stood like a monument to authority in the center of town, its marble steps worn smooth by decades of footsteps, its towering columns casting long shadows across the early morning light. Inside, the air carried a quiet tension, the kind that made voices lower and movements slower. Emma Carter stepped through the heavy glass doors, her modest navy cardigan draped neatly over her shoulders, her expression calm but unreadable. At 38, she looked like someone you might pass in a grocery store without a second glance, a high school literature teacher who spent her evenings grading papers and her weekends volunteering at the local library. There was nothing about her that suggested danger, nothing that hinted at the storm quietly building around her. But across the courtroom, seated high above the polished wooden floor, Judge Richard Hale watched her enter with a measured, almost satisfied gaze. He adjusted his cufflinks, his movements precise, controlled, every inch the image of authority. To him, Emma Carter was not a person. She was a problem, a voice that had dared to question him weeks earlier at a public hearing, speaking with a clarity that had unsettled him in ways he couldn't quite explain. And today, he intended to make an example out of her. The room began to fill, quiet murmurs rippling through the rows of spectators. A few recognized Emma, whispering behind raised hands, their eyes flickering with curiosity, with judgment. Word had spread quickly. A teacher summoned to court. Allegations unclear, but serious enough to draw attention. Emma felt the weight of those stares, but her posture didn't change. Her hands remained steady at her sides, her steps even as she moved toward the defense table. There was no rush, no panic. Only a quiet, deliberate composure that didn't belong to someone walking into what should have been a disaster. Judge Hale leaned forward slightly, his voice cutting cleanly through the room as he called the session to order. "Ms. Carter," he said, each word carefully measured, "you've been brought here today under serious circumstances." A faint smile touched his lips, one that never reached his eyes. "I trust you understand the gravity of your situation." A soft ripple moved through the audience. Emma looked up at him then, her gaze steady, unflinching, not defiant, not afraid, just steady. And for the briefest moment, something flickered across Hale's face. Something almost imperceptible. Then it was gone. The room fell into a heavy silence, the kind that seemed to press in from all sides, waiting. Waiting for her to falter. Waiting for her to confirm exactly what everyone already believed. That she didn't belong here. That she was out of her depth. That this would be over quickly. But Emma Carter didn't look like someone who was about to be broken. And Judge Hale, for all his confidence, had no idea that the quiet woman standing before him was about to turn his courtroom into something he could no longer control. The room held its breath. Judge Hale's gavel came down with a sharp, controlled sound that echoed across the courtroom, sealing the silence that had settled like a weight over everyone present. The clerk began reading the formal charges, each word deliberate, each phrase carefully constructed to sound official, undeniable, and heavy with consequence. Misrepresentation of legal documents. Failure to comply with a prior court directive. Potential obstruction. The language was dense, intimidating, designed not just to accuse but to overwhelm. A few people in the gallery shifted in their seats, exchanging quiet glances as the accusations stacked one on top of another. To them, it sounded serious enough to end a career, perhaps more. Emma stood still, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, her face composed in a way that almost seemed detached from the gravity of the moment. Judge Hale watched her closely, expecting the subtle signs he had seen countless times before, the tightening jaw, the nervous fidgeting, the desperate glance toward legal counsel that was not there. But Emma did none of those things. Instead, she listened, completely, as if each word mattered, as if she were memorizing the rhythm of the accusation rather than reacting to it. Hale leaned back slightly, folding his hands, his voice carrying a faint edge of satisfaction as he spoke again. "Ms. Carter, these are not minor concerns. You stand here without representation, facing a process that requires a clear understanding of legal procedure. I strongly advise that you reconsider your position before we proceed further. There was a pause, long enough to invite doubt, long enough for the room to expect hesitation. A low murmur rippled through the audience, some shaking their heads, others watching with quiet anticipation, already certain of how this would end. Emma lifted her eyes to meet his. There was no trace of confusion there, no sign of intimidation. Only a calm, steady focus that did not match the narrative being built around her. "Your Honor," she said, her voice even, measured, carrying just enough to be heard clearly without strain. "I understand the process." The words hung in the air, simple and unembellished, yet something about them shifted the atmosphere, almost imperceptibly. Judge Hale's expression tightened for a fraction of a second before smoothing over again. "Do you now?" he replied, a hint of condescension threading through his tone. "Then perhaps you would care to explain why the court records reflect noncompliance on your part." A few quiet chuckles slipped from the back rows, quickly stifled, but not unnoticed. The implication was clear. This was not a question meant to be answered. It was a setup, another step in a carefully constructed path. Emma did not respond immediately. Instead, she glanced briefly at the documents placed before her, her eyes moving across the pages with quiet precision. It was a small movement, but it carried a confidence that did not belong to someone lost in unfamiliar territory. The room grew still again, the kind of silence that stretched just a little too long, making people shift, making them aware that something was not unfolding as expected. Judge Hale tapped his pen lightly against the bench, the sound sharp against the quiet. "We are waiting, Miss Carter," he said, his patience thinning just enough to show. Emma looked back up, her expression unchanged. "Yes," she said softly. "I can see that." And for the first time, there was a pause that did not belong to her. It belonged to him. The room felt it. No one spoke. No one moved. Something had shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the first crack in something that had once seemed solid. And though Judge Hale still sat above everyone in that courtroom, the quiet certainty in Emma Carter's voice had begun to change the balance in a way no one could yet explain. The room held its breath again. Emma Carter let the silence settle for a moment longer, not out of hesitation, but out of control, as if she understood something about timing that no one else in the room quite grasped. Her fingers lightly touched the edge of the document in front of her, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm steadiness. But now there was something else beneath it, something sharper, more deliberate. "Your Honor," she said, "before I respond to the court's claim of noncompliance, I would like to clarify which specific filing date the court is referencing." A faint shift moved through the courtroom. It was a simple question, almost procedural, but it did not sound like the kind of question someone overwhelmed would ask. Judge Hale's expression remained composed, but his eyes narrowed slightly, just enough to signal a change. "The date is clearly indicated in the record," he replied, his tone tightening. "You were notified of your obligation and failed to meet it." Emma nodded once, as if acknowledging the statement without accepting it. "Yes," she said, her voice still even. "That is what the record suggests." The phrasing lingered in the air, subtle but precise. "Suggests," not confirms. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances again, this time not with quiet amusement, but with curiosity. Judge Hale tapped his pen once more, the sound sharper now. "If you have something to say, Miss Carter, I suggest you say it directly." There was a hint of impatience now, faint but unmistakable. Emma lowered her gaze briefly to the papers, then lifted them slightly, just enough for the movement to be noticed. "The notice referenced here," she continued, "was issued on March 15th. It requires a response within 10 business days." She paused, just long enough for the words to register. "Today is March 22nd. The room went still again, but this time it was not anticipation. It was calculation. People began doing the math in their heads, counting days, reconsidering what they had just heard. Judge Hale's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Court timelines are not always as simple as you are suggesting," he replied, his voice firmer now, less polished. Emma tilted her head slightly, not in defiance, but in quiet consideration. "Of course," she said, "which is why I reviewed the court's own procedural guidelines before arriving today. That did it." The shift was no longer subtle. It was visible. The confidence in her tone did not belong to someone guessing or hoping. It belonged to someone who knew exactly where she was standing. A man in the second row leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed. Even the clerk glanced up from the desk, her pen pausing mid-motion. Judge Hale adjusted his posture, sitting a little straighter, his hands now resting flat against the bench. "You are implying an error in the court's documentation," he said, each word carefully controlled. Emma met his gaze again, her expression unchanged. "I am pointing out a discrepancy," she replied. "One that directly affects the validity of the claim against me." The words did not rise. They did not demand attention, but they landed with a weight that could not be ignored. The room felt it. That quiet pressure, building just beneath the surface. Judge Hale opened his mouth to respond, then stopped for a fraction of a second, as if recalibrating, as if something had not gone according to plan. And in that brief pause, in that almost invisible hesitation, the first real crack appeared. The room did not react loudly. No one spoke, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of expectation. It was the silence of doubt. And for the first time since the proceedings began, it was not Emma Carter who stood alone under scrutiny. It was him. Judge Hale's fingers pressed slightly harder against the polished surface of the bench, a subtle shift that would have gone unnoticed by most, but not by those paying close attention. The authority in his posture remained, but the ease had begun to fade, replaced by something tighter, more controlled. "A discrepancy," he repeated, his voice measured, as if testing the word before allowing it to settle in the room. "You are suggesting that the court has made an error in its own timeline." Emma did not rush to answer. She allowed the statement to sit, to echo just enough for its weight to be felt. Then she spoke, her tone unchanged, calm and precise. "I am suggesting that the documentation, as presented, does not align with the court's established procedural standards." The phrasing was deliberate, careful, not accusatory, but not submissive either. It was the language of someone who understood exactly how far to go without overstepping. A faint murmur moved through the gallery again, but this time it carried a different energy, quieter, sharper, as if people were beginning to reassess what they were witnessing. Judge Hale leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on her now with more intensity than before. "Procedural standards are interpreted within the context of each case," he said, "and this court has the discretion to determine those interpretations." There it was. Authority, reinforced. A reminder of who controlled the room. But Emma did not react to it the way most would have. She nodded once, acknowledging the statement, then gently placed the document back down on the table. "Yes," she said. "That is correct." Another pause. Another beat of silence. And then, just as evenly, she continued. "Which is why I would like to request clarification on whether the court is applying standard business day calculations or calendar day calculations in this instance." The question landed differently. It was not defensive. It was not emotional. It was technical, specific. The kind of question that required an exact answer, not a broad assertion of authority. The clerk looked up again, her expression tightening slightly as she glanced toward Judge Hale. Even she seemed to recognize the shift. Hale's jaw set more firmly this time, and for a brief moment, he did not answer. It was only a second, maybe less, but in a room that quiet, it stretched longer than it should have. "The court operates under its own defined parameters," he said finally, his tone sharper now, less polished than before. Emma's eyes did not leave his. "Of course," she replied. "And those parameters are documented in the court's procedural handbook, Section 3, subsection B." A few heads turned. Someone in the back leaned forward, trying to hear more clearly. The specificity of her response cut through the room like a line drawn with precision. She was not guessing. She was citing. Judge Hale's expression changed again, just slightly, but enough. The confidence that had once filled his voice was now carrying something else, something closer to resistance than control. "This is not a seminar, Ms. Carter," he said. "You are here to respond to the charges, not to question the court's procedures." Emma inclined her head slightly, her voice still steady, still composed. "I understand that, Your Honor, and my response is directly tied to whether the court's claim of noncompliance is valid under its own rules." The room went completely still. Not a shuffle, not a whisper. Even the faint sounds from the hallway outside seemed to disappear. Judge Hale's pen stopped tapping. His hand stilled completely. For a moment, he said nothing. And in that silence, something undeniable settled over the courtroom. The structure of the moment had shifted. This was no longer a one-sided proceeding moving toward a predictable conclusion. This was something else, something uncertain. And as Emma Carter stood there, her posture unchanged, her voice quiet but unwavering, it became clear to everyone watching that the case unfolding in front of them was not going to follow the path Judge Hale had planned. The room did not need anyone to say it. They could feel it. The balance had begun to tilt. Judge Hale's gaze hardened, but beneath that carefully constructed authority, there was now something else beginning to surface, something far less controlled. The kind of tension that came when a script no longer followed its intended path. He adjusted the papers in front of him, a small, deliberate motion, as if reasserting control through routine. "Ms. Carter," he said, his tone cooler now, sharper at the edges. "This court will not be redirected by selective interpretations of procedural language. You are here to answer for your failure to comply." The words were firmer, more forceful, but they lacked the effortless dominance they carried just minutes before. Emma did not respond immediately. Instead, she reached calmly into her folder and retrieved a single sheet of paper, placing it gently on the table in front of her. The movement was unhurried, precise, almost understated. Yet it drew attention, because it did not feel like someone scrambling. It felt like someone presenting. The room noticed. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "I would like to submit a copy of the notice I received, along with the time-stamped record of its delivery." The clerk hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping forward to take the document, her eyes briefly scanning the page before placing it on the bench. Judge Hale glanced down, just briefly, but it was enough. Enough for the smallest flicker to cross his expression. The audience saw it. They might not have understood what it meant, but they felt the shift. Emma continued, not louder, not faster, but with a quiet certainty that seemed to fill the room more than any raised voice could. The notice was delivered electronically at 4:42 p.m. on March 15th, she said. According to the court's own filing system, submissions received after 4:30 p.m. are processed as next business day entries. She paused, just long enough for the implication to settle, which places the effective filing date on March 16th. A ripple moved through the courtroom, subtle but undeniable. Heads tilted, eyes narrowed. Calculations began again. Judge Hale's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the bench. "Even if that were the case," he replied, his voice pressing forward, attempting to regain ground, "the obligation to respond remains unchanged." Emma nodded once, as if agreeing in principle. "Yes," she said, "but the timeline does not." She let that sit. Then, gently, she added, 10 business days from March 16th places the response deadline on March 30th. The words landed cleanly. No emphasis, no dramatics, just fact. The clerk's pen hovered above her notes, unmoving. A man in the front row exhaled slowly, almost involuntarily. Someone in the back shifted, the sound of fabric against wood suddenly loud in the quiet. Judge Hale looked down again at the document, this time longer. His eyes moved across the lines, slower now, more carefully. When he looked back up, the confidence that once defined his expression had changed. It had not disappeared, but it had been forced to adjust, to account for something he had not anticipated. "Deadlines," he said, his tone measured but tighter, "are subject to interpretation based on case context." Emma met his gaze without hesitation. "Then I respectfully request that the court clarify its interpretation on record," she said. "Because as it stands, the claim of noncompliance appears to be based on a timeline that does not align with the court's own documented system." The room went completely silent. Not the kind of silence that waits, the kind that listens. Judge Hale did not speak immediately. His pen remained still. His posture, though still elevated, no longer felt untouchable. For the first time, the weight of the room had shifted away from Emma Carter. And in that quiet, undeniable moment, it became clear to everyone present that this was no longer a proceeding controlled by authority alone. It was a contest of precision. And Emma Carter was not the one losing. Judge Hale remained silent longer than anyone in the room expected, his eyes still fixed on the document in front of him, as if searching for something that would restore the certainty he had lost. The air in the courtroom had changed completely now, no longer tense with anticipation of Emma's failure, but charged with something far more unpredictable. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled, but the sharpness had deepened, like steel pressed too hard. "Ms. Carter," he said, "you are making a technical argument, but this court is concerned with compliance, not semantics." It was an attempt to reframe the moment, to pull the focus back into territory where authority could still dominate. But Emma did not follow him there. She did not argue. She did not push. Instead, she took a small breath, the kind that signaled clarity rather than hesitation. "Respectfully, Your Honor," she replied. "In matters of law, technical accuracy is the foundation of compliance." The sentence settled with a quiet weight that no one could ignore. A few heads in the gallery nodded almost imperceptibly, as if recognizing the truth in what she said before realizing they had reacted at all. Judge Hale's fingers curled slightly against the bench, his composure holding, but no longer effortless. Emma continued, her voice steady, unhurried, each word placed with intention. "If the timeline used to determine noncompliance is incorrect, then the conclusion drawn from that timeline cannot be considered valid." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The clarity of the logic carried further than volume ever could. The clerk shifted again, glancing between Emma and the judge, her expression no longer neutral but alert, engaged. The room listened more closely now, not because they were told to, but because they could not look away. Judge Hale straightened, reclaiming what posture he could, his voice firming again, though it carried a trace of strain beneath the surface. "And yet you chose to appear here today without legal representation," he said. "That decision alone suggests a lack of understanding of the seriousness of these proceedings." It was a calculated move, an attempt to undermine her credibility, to re-establish hierarchy. A few murmurs returned, softer this time, uncertain. Emma did not react to them. She held his gaze, her expression unchanged, and, for a moment, the silence stretched again, not awkward, but deliberate. Then she spoke. "I chose to appear without representation," she said, "because I am fully capable of understanding and responding to the legal issues presented." The words were simple, but something about the way she said them made the room still again. Not defensive, not proud, just certain. Judge Hale's eyes narrowed slightly. "That is a bold claim," he said. Emma gave the smallest nod. "It is a factual one." Another pause. Another shift. The audience could feel it now, the subtle unraveling of something that had once seemed fixed. The power in the room was no longer moving in a single direction. It was being questioned, redirected, tested in real time. Emma reached again into her folder, but this time she did not immediately produce a document. Instead, her hand rested there for a moment, as if choosing carefully what came next. When she withdrew it, she held a thin stack of papers, neatly organized, edges aligned with precision. She placed them on the table with the same quiet control she had shown from the beginning. "Your Honor," she said, "if the court permits, I would like to address not only the timeline discrepancy, but also the origin of the notice itself." The words landed differently, heavier, more deliberate. A subtle ripple moved through the room, sharper this time, charged with something new. This was no longer just about dates. Judge Hale's posture stiffened. "Be careful, Ms. Carter," he said, his tone lower now, more warning than instruction. Emma met his gaze without hesitation. "I intend to be precise," she replied. And in that moment, the room understood something before it was spoken aloud. The case was no longer about whether Emma Carter had failed to comply. It was about whether the foundation of the accusation itself could withstand what she was about to reveal. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was expectant, and for the first time, it was not waiting for her to fail. It was waiting for her to continue. The moment Emma Carter finished speaking, the air in the courtroom shifted again, but this time it was sharper, more focused, like the calm before something inevitable. Judge Hale's warning still lingered, but it no longer carried the same weight it once did. It sounded less like control and more like resistance. Emma did not rush forward. She let the silence stretch just enough to make every eye in the room settle fully on her. Then, with the same quiet precision, she slid the stack of papers slightly forward. "The notice in question," she began, her voice even, "originated from the court's automated filing system. However, the routing metadata attached to this document indicates manual modification prior to delivery. A ripple of confusion moved through the gallery. The words were technical, but the implication was clear enough to make people lean in. Judge Hale's expression did not change immediately, but the stillness in his posture became more rigid, less natural. "That is a serious assertion," he said, his tone low, controlled. "You should be certain of what you are implying." Emma met his gaze without hesitation. "I am not implying," she replied. "I am identifying." The distinction landed heavily. The clerk glanced quickly at the document now in front of her, her eyes scanning more carefully this time, her pen forgotten in her hand. Emma continued, her delivery steady, deliberate, each word placed with intention. The document's header includes a revision timestamp at 3:58 p.m. on March 15th. That timestamp does not align with the system's automated release schedule, which logs all outbound notices at standardized intervals. A man in the second row shifted forward again, his brow furrowed deeper now. Even those who did not fully understand the technical details could feel the direction this was moving. Judge Hale's fingers pressed flat against the bench, no longer tapping, no longer moving. "System irregularities do not invalidate a notice," he said, but the confidence in his voice had thinned, just enough to be noticed. Emma gave a small, almost respectful nod. "Correct," she said, "unless those irregularities affect the integrity of the document's issuance." Another pause, another beat of silence. Then she added, "Which, in this case, they do." The room went completely still. Not a whisper, not a breath out of place. Judge Hale did not respond immediately. For the first time, his gaze dropped fully to the papers, his eyes moving across them with a focus that was no longer performative. It was searching, verifying. Emma did not interrupt. She waited, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. When he finally looked up again, the shift was undeniable. The authority was still there, but it was no longer unquestioned. "Explain," he said, his voice quieter now, but edged with something else, something closer to caution than command. Emma inclined her head slightly. "The revision timestamp corresponds with a user-level override," she said, meaning the notice was accessed and altered before it was finalized and sent. A subtle stir moved through the courtroom, sharper this time, more alert. The clerk's eyes widened slightly as she looked down again, her attention now fully engaged. Judge Hale's jaw tightened, his composure holding, but no longer unshaken. "And you are suggesting that this override affected the timeline?" he asked. Emma did not hesitate. "Yes," she said. "Specifically, the classification of the delivery time, which directly impacts the compliance window." The logic unfolded cleanly, step by step, leaving little room for dismissal. The audience could feel it now, not just tension, but realization beginning to take shape. This was not a misunderstanding. This was something structured, something intentional. Judge Hale opened his mouth to respond, then paused, just briefly, as if weighing his words more carefully than before. And in that hesitation, in that single moment where certainty failed to arrive on command, the room understood what had been building all along. The foundation of the case was no longer solid, and Emma Carter was not just defending herself. She was exposing something far deeper than anyone had expected. The room did not move. It did not speak. It simply watched, as the balance continued to shift in a way that could no longer be reversed. The silence that followed Emma Carter's last words did not feel empty anymore. It felt full, dense with realization, with questions that no one dared to voice yet. Judge Hale sat perfectly still, but the stillness now carried a different meaning. It was no longer the stillness of control. It was the stillness of someone recalculating in real time. Emma did not move to fill the silence. She allowed it to settle, to expand, to press gently against the walls of the courtroom until it could no longer be ignored. Then she spoke again, her voice calm, measured, but now carrying a clarity that cut deeper than before. "Your Honor, if the notice was modified prior to release, and that modification altered the classification of its delivery time, then the timeline used to establish noncompliance is not just inaccurate. It is constructed." The word landed with precision. Constructed, not mistaken, not misunderstood. Built. A subtle reaction moved through the room, sharper this time, impossible to hide. The clerk's pen slipped slightly in her fingers before she caught it again. Someone in the back exhaled quietly, the sound more noticeable than it should have been. Judge Hale's expression remained composed, But the composure now required effort. It showed in the slight tightening around his eyes, in the way his shoulders held just a fraction more tension than before. "You are drawing conclusions that exceed your position in this proceeding," he said, his voice controlled, but lacking the certainty it once carried. Emma's gaze did not waver. "I am following the evidence presented within the court's own system," she replied. No emphasis, no challenge, just fact. Another pause followed, but this time it felt different. It was not waiting. It was pressing. Judge Hale glanced briefly toward the clerk, a movement so small it might have gone unnoticed, except that now, everyone was watching everything. The clerk lowered her eyes quickly, returning to the document, her expression no longer neutral, but careful. Very careful. Emma took a small step forward, not crossing any boundary, but enough to shift her presence slightly closer to the center of the room. "There is one more detail," she said. The words were quiet, but they carried weight. The kind of weight that made people sit a little straighter without realizing it. Judge Hale did not respond immediately. He simply watched her, his gaze sharper now, more guarded. Emma lifted a single page from her stack, holding it just enough for the movement to be seen. "The user identification attached to the manual override," she continued, "is not anonymized." The room did not react loudly. It did not need to. The implication moved faster than sound. Judge Hale's fingers, resting on the bench, stilled completely. Emma's voice remained steady, unwavering. "It is linked to a registered administrative account with elevated access privileges." Another pause. Longer this time. Heavy. The kind of silence that did not just fill the room, but defined it. Judge Hale's gaze dropped again, this time not to scan, not to confirm, but to absorb. When he looked back up, something had changed. Not just in his expression, but in the space around him. The authority was still present, but it no longer stood alone. It was now accompanied by something else. Exposure. Emma did not raise her voice. She did not press harder. She simply completed the line of logic she had been building from the very beginning. "Which means," she said softly, "the timeline used against me was not only inaccurate, but directly influenced before it was entered into record." No one spoke. No one moved. The room had reached a point where reaction felt unnecessary, almost inappropriate. Because what was unfolding was no longer a matter of argument. It was a matter of recognition. Judge Hale opened his mouth, but no words came immediately. For the first time, the pause belonged entirely to him. Not strategic, not controlled, real. And in that moment, in that quiet, unmistakable shift, everyone in the courtroom understood something that could no longer be undone. The case had turned. Completely. And the person who had once stood alone at the center of judgment was no longer the one being examined. Judge Hale's silence stretched longer than anyone in the courtroom could remember, long enough for the weight of what had just been revealed to fully settle into every corner of the room. The authority he once carried so effortlessly now seemed distant, like something that belonged to a moment that had already passed. His eyes remained fixed on the document before him, but it was no longer a glance of control. It was recognition. Slow. Unavoidable. Emma Carter did not speak. She did not move. She stood exactly as she had from the beginning, her posture calm, her expression steady, as if she had never needed the room to believe her, only to listen long enough to understand. The clerk shifted slightly, her voice quieter than before as she cleared her throat. "Your Honor," she said carefully, "the metadata, it does appear to indicate manual override tied to an administrative account." The words were measured, cautious, but they carried enough confirmation to remove any remaining doubt. A faint ripple moved through the gallery, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable. People were no longer whispering in speculation. They were processing something real. Judge Hale finally lifted his gaze, but when he looked out across the room, it was not with the same certainty. Something had changed, not just in how he was seen, but in how he now had to see himself within the moment. He opened his mouth to speak, but for a brief second, no. Words followed. Then, carefully, he straightened, drawing in a controlled breath. "This court," he began, his voice slower now, each word chosen with precision, "acknowledges that there are discrepancies in the procedural handling of the notice presented." The admission was subtle, but it landed with weight far greater than any raised voice could have carried. Emma did not react. She did not smile. She did not shift. She simply listened, the same way she had from the start. Judge Hale continued, though the rhythm of his speech had changed, less commanding, more deliberate. Given the information now on record, the claim of noncompliance cannot be upheld under the current timeline. The room went completely still, as if even the air had paused to mark the moment. A man in the front row leaned back slowly, exhaling as if he had been holding his breath for far longer than he realized. The clerk lowered her gaze again, her pen finally moving across the page. Emma inclined her head slightly, not in victory, but in acknowledgement. Judge Hale's hands rested flat against the bench, no longer gripping, no longer pressing. "The matter before this court is therefore dismissed," he said, the finality of the statement clear, but absent of the authority it once would have carried. It was not dominance. It was conclusion. Another silence followed, but this one felt different. Lighter. Clearer. The kind of silence that comes after something has been resolved, even if not everyone is ready to admit it. Emma gathered her papers slowly, neatly, the same way she had placed them down. There was no rush in her movements, no need to linger. As she turned to leave, the eyes that followed her were no longer filled with judgment. They were filled with something quieter, something closer to respect. Judge Hale remained seated, watching, but he did not speak again. He did not interrupt, because there was nothing left to control. And as the courtroom doors closed softly behind Emma Carter, the room was left with a truth that did not need to be announced. Power, when used without integrity, does not collapse loudly. It unravels quietly, in moments like this, where precision meets patience, and the truth simply refuses to be ignored. The room remained still, as if remembering exactly what dignity looks like.